Hello and welcome to A Picture in 1,000 Words. I'm Michael Fiedler. This one is Where Do We Go From Here? Chapter 2. And with this one, it's on the heels of my previous episode where I talk about how in a sort of a moment of darkness through this whole sort of self-isolation and other things, kind of came to rediscover that nuclear energy could be a big part of our 21st century existence if we choose to be in a relatively sustainable and harmonious way. That position is debatable, but that's where I was and am. One of the prevailing challenges that's mentioned in that episode is that people are afraid of nuclear energy, and there's just sort of a fear about it, and that's really what's getting in the way. And so I wanted to kind of return to that conversation. It's a topic that I've really found fascinating, that I've been really kind of focusing on the last 4 weeks or so. And right now, we're all dealing with a very clear and present fear with this coronavirus, and it's affecting us all. And that is different than other challenges that are happening right now, or were happening before coronavirus, and it's likely going to happen after coronavirus, is a water crisis. And I don't want to be a Debbie Downer, but it's sort of something that is sort of a fundamental global need. But unlike coronavirus, some people are safe from it. So those that are in affluent countries, or people like myself, probably most of you listening to this would probably have access to fresh running water. A lot of the world is not in that camp. I think it's somewhere between 20 and 25%, depending on your reference. And to that effect, there's a great episode of Explained on Netflix on the water crisis, which I'll include in the show notes along with a bunch of other stuff. But that kind of brings the importance of water to the forefront in a way that maybe people don't take it as seriously as they should. And I'm going to start in the upper left corner of the visual now, of a quote from a really inspiring mind. And it's that fresh, clean water cannot be taken for granted. And it is not. Water is political and litigious. And this is a quote from a guy named Michael Burry. And if you don't know who that is, he's Christian Bale's character in The Big Short, which is a spectacular movie on a tough subject, but it's a brilliant unpacking of how, at least for a handful of people, significant opportunity was seized in chaos. And Michael Burry is sort of one of the ones who is really credited with really taking advantage of the housing bubble and taking out insurance claims against it, and that's how he made a ton of money when the market crashed. And at the end of the movie, they make a big show about how he got out of investment banking after this event, and then focused primarily on water. And so not only is it something that Netflix cares about, but it's also something that a 100 millionaire who is one of the most brilliant people out there. And I should say that he's also an MD. And if you look up that history, he's actually a really interesting person top to bottom, but the MD part of it is also really interesting. But he's a brilliant mind that I find really inspiring. And that's sort of where the nuclear visual, and that's in sort of front and center, kind of comes into play. And in reading up on nuclear energy, and of course I was fascinated as a child. I loved movies like Broken Arrow and Independence Day that used nukes. It was just so cool. But I've sort of had an interesting refresher over the last month or so, and I've kind of realized that nuclear energy has this really spiritual companion in water. Take the obvious, you're looking at sort of two rods going into the water. They release heat, and that's how you get nuclear power. So that's pretty obvious. But it's also capable of making fresh water. And it's something that is done on submarines. And they take in salt water, they boil it like you wouldn't believe, and they can get fresh water that they can use to shower or cook or cool a reactor if they want to do it that way. Although they can probably use seawater for that. But anyway, they can make a lot of fresh water. They can make like 40,000 gallons of fresh water a day on a submarine. But commercial desalinization, of what you would imagine, is not done by nuclear energy. And it's nice if you have this nuclear battery that's sitting next to you to boil water on a submarine. But for the most part, if you're talking about desalinization at a population level, it's not done that way. It's done through reverse osmosis, which is where you shove water through a membrane and catch the salt particles. And it does a decent job. It does leave a pollutant, which is the brine, this high concentrated salt after effect, and it's imperfect. And but it's done this way because it's energy efficient and it's relatively cheap. Nuclear could be used to make fresh water, and actually there is a lot of literature and opinions about this that go back to like the 70s about deploying nuclear energy to make fresh water, because it just seemed like a really good use of a lot of energy. And I kind of snapped the focus there of this sort of nuclear H2O, essentially, because I feel like that is where our mind is a good directionality for how we should look at nuclear energy. We look at it with a fearful context, and it's sort of something that gives us anxiety. But if it could be viewed as something that it was the source of fresh water, and that's sort of how the energy was applied, it could really change the way people think about it, at least in the next upcoming generation that isn't going to know anything about Chernobyl or the Cold War. With a clean slate, who knows? But this is a tricky landscape. One guy who I drew a lot of inspiration from for chapter 1 was a guy named Michael Schellenberger, who gave this TED talk about nuclear energy that I recommend taking a look at. But he has also been sort of quoted as sort of seeing that not only does nuclear have a conflict with the non-believers, but it also has conflict with other renewables. So there's sort of this opinion that nuclear will box out opportunities for wind and solar to their detriment, and that's sort of almost an infighting in these climate change energy solutions as well. And there's another writer who's also really intense about his opinions against nuclear energy, and he primarily makes an economic argument, which is sound. I can't really disagree with it. But this gentleman, Amory Lovins, and he makes a fantastic argument against nuclear energy and how it's not a solution, but his main emphasis is on the fact that it's going to cost a lot and it's going to take a long time. And I'm of the mind that we didn't get into climate change quickly. We're not going to get out of it quickly, and probably not cheaply either. So I'm not deterred from a sort of as close to a neon bullet as I have illustrated here for a climate change solution. And one mind who is sort of a big, bold thinker in this is a guy named Jim Conca, which is where the sort of quote in the lower right corner comes from. He is an interesting counterpoint to Amory Lovins. All of these literature that I'm mentioning, Schellenberger, Jim Covens, and Amory Lovins, they've all published in Forbes for whatever reason, so that's a commonality. I'm not sure what that means, but that's sort of like where this conversation that I've noticed is happening. But anyway, he's a writer for Forbes, and he does a lot of writing on nuclear energy and has some really fascinating ideas. One is to have, if we just had 1,500 nuclear reactors, we could solve our water crisis essentially. So that'll be part of the show notes as well. But I have a quote here that really blew my mind in terms of like what the ceiling was for water. And that's actually that you can get uranium, you can get the fuel for nuclear energy from the ocean. And just how bananas is that? About 5 years ago, a collaborative research effort sort of figured out a way to hang these sort of like long kelp-like filters in the ocean, and can aggregate uranium over the course of like weeks or a few months to aggregate like substantive quantities of uranium. And they did some extrapolation, and there's like 1 billion tons of uranium in the ocean, which has this crazy concentration relationship with our Earth's core. So it's essentially limitless. We will never run out. And if deployed effectively, uranium seawater extraction makes nuclear power completely renewable. And that's Jim Conca's quote. And so we're not there. Looking back to Michael Burry's quote about the importance of fresh water, it's completely on the opposite end of the slide as Jim Conca's quote. And that's sort of like how these two ideas feel. But this nuclear H2O that I've tried to illustrate here is what I think a potential bridge between one to the other. And I'm sure there are plenty of reasons to not believe this, to question it, to doubt it. And I think going back to the sort of divisiveness of our world is that we can be really fixated on what's right, what's correct. And what's challenging is that multiple people can be right. Jim Conca's right. His adversary, Amory Lovins, is right. Mike Schellenberger's probably right. Michael Burry was right. That doesn't necessarily lead to action. And thinking about it from like a medicine context, like when you're trying to treat a patient, there's not a right or wrong answer. There's just what works. And this could conceivably work. There's all reasons to speculate on it, a lot of them around leadership and how human beings conduct themselves. But now that we've seen what an existential crisis looks like, are we willing to evolve? And that's what it's going to take.